In 1992, fishing boats that had cast nets for 5 centuries suddenly sat empty. The Newfoundland cod, billions of them, had vanished overnight, and 40,000 people watched the entire world dissolve in a single decade. In 1949, a Newfoundland fisherman could feed his family for a year on what he caught in 3 months. The cod were so thick in the waters off the Grand Banks that nets filled in hours. For 500 years, since Europeans first arrived in the 1490s, this fishery had been the reason Newfoundland existed at all. By the 1980s, it employed 40,000 people directly, and another 100,000 depended on it indirectly through processing plants, shipyards, and supply shops that lined every coastal town from St. John's to Gander to 1,000 smaller settlements clinging to the rocks. A typical morning meant leaving the harbor at dawn in wooden boats called longers or draggers, weighted down with salt and ice. Men worked 12, 14, sometimes 18-hour days. They knew the banks by feel, Flemish Cap, the Virgin Rocks, the tail. The work was brutal and dangerous. Men drowned regularly. But the money was reliable, the tradition was everything, and the fish seemed infinite. By 1970, industrial trawlers from Spain, Portugal, the Soviet Union, and Canada itself had arrived with sonar and nets the size of churches. They took everything. Scientists warned the government. Fishermen watched the catches decline through the late 1970s and 1980s. Official quotas kept dropping, 282,000 tons in 1977 down to 235,000 by 1989. The cod population was collapsing in real time, but the industry and the governments that regulated it kept insisting the stocks would recover. They had survived 5 centuries of fishing. What could possibly go wrong? In 1992, Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans announced a discovery that would change everything. The northern cod stock had fallen below the point of recovery, and the fishery had to close immediately. The warning signs were everywhere. Nobody wanted to see them. By the 1970s, foreign fishing fleets had discovered what Newfoundlanders had always known. The Grand Banks held the richest cod stocks in the world. Soviet factory ships, Spanish trawlers, Portuguese vessels. They arrived with industrial capacity that made traditional boats look like toys. In 1968, catches peaked at 810,000 tons. The cod seemed infinite. Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans watched this happen. They had the data. Marine biologist Wilfred Templeman warned repeatedly through the 1970s and 1980s that catches were unsustainable. The quotas kept climbing anyway. Politicians needed the jobs. Communities needed the exports. The industry needed to grow. By 1989, something had shifted in the water itself. Catches began to collapse. The department's own stock assessments showed the northern cod population plummeting from over 1.6 million tons of spawning biomass in 1962 to just a fraction of that. Scientists submitted reports marked urgent. Bureaucrats circulated memos with phrases like stock depletion and recruitment failure. Cabinet ministers discussed it in private. In Parliament, they said nothing. Meanwhile, 40,000 people depended on this fishery. Entire towns had no other economy, no factories, no tourism, no alternatives. They had elected governments that promised to protect their livelihoods. Those governments made different choices. They subsidized new boats. They increased quotas. They told people the ocean would provide. On July the 2nd, 1992, Fisheries Minister John Crosbie stood before cameras and announced what the department had known for years. The fishery was closed. Not temporarily. The northern cod stock had crashed below recovery threshold. 40,000 jobs would vanish. But the real question The one nobody asked in that press conference was how long officials had known before they finally acted. By 1989, the cod were already gone. Nobody wanted to admit it. The warning signs had been visible for years. In 1974, Canada extended its territorial waters to 200 nautical miles, shutting out foreign trawlers. Fisheries Minister Romeo LeBlanc promised this would save the industry. Instead, Canadian boats simply caught more. By 1986, the total allowable catch, the TSC, the official limit, was set at 266,000 tons. Scientists at the Department of Fisheries and Oceans knew the real number was closer to 40,000. They said so in their reports. Nobody listened. In 1988, the TAC was cut to 235,000 tons. Still too high. Still ignored. Stocks continued their vertical drop. The Canadian fleet, now equipped with sonar, GPS, and factory ships that could process fish at sea, was mechanically efficient at only one thing: deletion. Then came the moment. July 2nd, 92. Fisheries Minister John Crosbie stood in St. John's and announced a moratorium on northern cod. The resource has collapsed, he said flatly. 2 years, he promised. 2 years and it would recover. It was the largest industrial closure in Canadian history. 40,000 fishing licenses revoked. Hundreds of boats tied up at the wharf. Entire towns, Twillingate, Gaultois, Grey Islands, Change Islands, suddenly had no economy at all. The government began issuing income support, welfare, for fishermen whose families had worked these waters since the 1500s. By 1993, the moratorium had extended to all Atlantic cod stocks. The closure that was supposed to last 24 months continued. The stocks never came back. What investigators would later discover was a systematic discrepancy. The numbers the government had been using to manage the fishery weren't just wrong. They appeared to have been deliberately inflated. By July 1992, 40,000 people woke up unemployed. The cod were gone. What remained was a wound that Canada's Atlantic provinces are still learning to live with. In Saints John's and Corner Brook, in 100 villages whose names few outside Newfoundland knew, the arithmetic of sudden collapse was brutal and personal. A fisher with 30 years on the water, a plant worker with 2 children, a merchant whose family had traded cod for 4 generations. The northern cod stock, which scientists had assured Ottawa would sustain indefinitely, had dropped from 1.9 million tonnes in 1990 to fewer than 22,000 tonnes by the time Fisheries Minister John Crosbie announced the moratorium. A 99% collapse in 2 years. The government's response came wrapped in bureaucracy, emergency income support, retraining programs. By 1994, the Atlantic Groundfish Strategy, or TAGS, was distributing roughly $1 billion to cushion the shock. It was generous by welfare standards. It was insulting to people who had built their lives on work, not charity. Social workers reported spikes in depression, suicide, domestic violence. The infrastructure of entire towns, plants, wharves, merchant operations began to rust. But something else was happening in files and laboratories. Fisheries scientists began comparing notes. What investigators would later discover was systematic. The assessment models used to manage the stock since the 1970s had relied on catch data that now appeared unreliable. Some stocks had been counted using underwater acoustic surveys that didn't actually detect cod. Government quotas had been set using numbers that, in retrospect, bore little resemblance to what was actually swimming in the Atlantic. The question wasn't whether the data was wrong. The question was whether anyone had known it was wrong before 40,000 people lost everything. Someone knew. That's what the paper trail shows. By 1989, The Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans had internal documents, later obtained under access to information requests, projecting catastrophic stock collapse within 5 years. Biologist Jeffrey Hutchings would publish peer-reviewed warnings in 1992. Yet the fishing licenses kept issuing. The boats kept leaving St. John's in Twillingate and Corner Brook. Politicians in St. John's said the stocks would recover. They were wrong. Today, the Grand Banks remain largely empty. The cod populations have not rebounded in 30 years. Some scientists attribute this to changing ocean temperatures. Others point to ecosystem shift, to seals, to Capeland collapse, to the sheer depletion that made recovery impossible. The dispute itself is telling. We still don't fully understand what we broke. But the human archive is clearer. In Port aux Basques, the fish processing plants stand hollow. In Gautois, the population fell from 2,000 to fewer than 200. The 1992 moratorium became permanent. In 1994, 40,000 people were suddenly without work. Government income support, called adjustment assistance, became the wage of entire towns. By 2000, over $2 billion in public money had gone to welfare payments in Newfoundland. No industry has ever recovered from this. What remains are the records, the Department of Fisheries files, the oral histories collected by Memorial University, the photographs of empty docks, the 1968 prediction by fisheries officer W.R. Martin that the industry would collapse, a memo filed and ignored for 24 years. The question wasn't whether anyone knew, they knew. The question is why knowing changed nothing. A thriving civilization didn't fail because of laziness or incompetence. It collapsed because no one was watching the numbers until it was too late. Another file is already open, the Dust Bowl farmers who lost everything to a storm they created. If you want to see how industries die before we notice, subscribe to the archive.